Well, hey everyone, welcome back to Pushing the Limits. It's fantastic to have you with me. Today I have Andy Blow with me. Andy, all the way from Christchurch, but not in New Zealand, in England. Welcome to the show. Lovely to have you.
Thanks, Lisa. Nice to be here. Yeah.
We're connected because you're an endurance athlete. You're an expert in the space of electrolytes and nutrition and fueling for athletes. You're connected with Precision Fuel and Hydration, which fantastic company that has some fantastic products that we're going to talk a little bit today. So this is an episode for the athletes out there, the endurance athletes, the wannabe athletes, anybody who's interested in fueling right and getting the right combination of fueling going for your training. This is the episode for you. So Andy, can you, before we get into the sciencey stuff, can you give me a personal background on you and what you do and where you come from?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you said right at the start. I'm based in Christchurch, but it is always called the other Christchurch because whenever I say that to people, they think, "Oh, he's in New Zealand." And no, there's a smaller Christchurch on the south coast of the UK, which is now home. That's a picture for anyone who's watching. They can see a picture of it. Yeah, it's a lovely little coastal seaside place on the south coast of England. But yeah, I'm not from here. I grew up in the Midlands in the UK, and I played a bit of soccer, football, as a lot of kids do, and did a bit of cross country and a bit of swimming. And it wasn't until my late teens that I found triathlon, and that kind of, although I'd been pursuing a bit of running and a bit of cycling, a little bit competitively, I kind of really got my teeth into triathlon probably about 25 years ago when it was still quite a relatively small sport. And that's what really got me interested in endurance sports and pushing the limits of that. And I trained at university basically full time and went full time as an athlete for a while as well. Wow. So I kind of had that's what basically lit my fire for endurance. And it was through that I studied sports science at uni as well. So I kind of brought those two things together in what I ended up doing after university, working with athletes and eventually setting up Precision Fuel and Hydration.
Brilliant. That sounds brilliant. So did you do the longer triathlons or the shorter ones, or what was your specialty distance?
I did everything, to be honest with you. I started with the short stuff, and I was targeting probably a little bit. It probably wasn't realistic for me to target it, but I was sort of gunning for 2004 Athens Olympics was sort of the thing that I was really interested in, and sort of training with a lot of the guys that made it into that squad. I was on the periphery of that squad, and so I was a decent athlete, but not a real, world-class athlete. And like a lot of people, then you migrate, if you're not good at the faster stuff or as good, then you migrate to the longer stuff. And I did a bit of Xterra. Yeah, I did quite a bit of Ironman racing. I probably had my best results at Ironman or half Ironman. So I got a podium at half Ironman and top 10s in Ironman races.
Wow.
Times. And then after that, once that had fizzled out for me, I kept my hand in and still keep my hand in a little bit, but I did things like I've been over to New Zealand actually and done coast to coast a few years ago. 10 years ago, actually. I did that in 2012, and I've done swim run races and other long stuff, but I reckon my sweet spot, I'm pretty good when it gets beyond an hour, but it's less than 5 or 6 hours. That tends to be my sweet spot. I've done some of the 10, 12, 15, 20 hour stuff, and I can do it, but I don't know, I seem to be like a middle long endurance athlete for my optimum performance.
Where your genetics lie, so to speak. As opposed to mine, like I was just terribly slow, asthmatic, no lung capacity, no VO2 max. It was dreadful. So I had to go like 200 plus K to be any good. I was sort of the last one standing. It was the only thing that I could do.
I literally and metaphorically take my hat off to the people that do the 24-hour plus thing. I always had this running joke with some people I used to train with that basically it wasn't like a decent event for me as long as you could have breakfast before it and dinner after it, then it was like that was okay. But when you start missing more than one meal, I'm less interested. Or missing sleep.
Missing a couple of days sleep. So, and it is my take on the whole space now is, I've retired from doing the super long stuff anymore. It is that, it's a fantastic thing to have an experience in, because you learn so much about what you're capable of and pushing the limits. But doing it, in and out all year round and for 25 years. And, I did it for a long, long time, 25 years of doing it, off and on, mostly on. There's a lot of health issues that came along with that, because it does break you down, and it does cause a lot of inflammation, and it causes hormonal imbalances and all of that sort of stuff. But you do learn the mental game. I think that's the biggest takeaway that I got out of it was how was the mental strength. So if we don't get into now a little bit into the nitty gritty on the science, because I love what your website is pretty brilliant, actually, with all the really in-depth articles on things like cramps and sodium for athletes, and how much is enough hydration, and carb fueling, and we talked briefly before the interview about fat adapted athletes and stuff, so we might get into that a little bit as well. So what made you actually get into doing precision fuel and hydration? What was the impetus behind that?
I think it was the typical thing that gets most athletes, and it was a personal problem that I had. I would typically, with these races, I would race pretty well in cool conditions. So all of my best races generally came in cold or cool weather conditions. Mm-hmm. As soon as it got hot, and as soon as I was sweating a lot, my performances would fall off a cliff, and it was not seemingly all that linked to my fitness level. I remember going into my first Ironman, which was only in Switzerland, but it's Ironman Switzerland actually is pretty hot most years, and it was like high 20s, low 30s degrees Celsius, and I was in great shape, and I think I did 10 and a half hours, which might not sound like a terrible result, but I was kind of probably punching in training with guys that were racing 9 hours, and I was expecting to be like, maybe not in the top 10, but kind of maybe worrying the top 10, and to suddenly come 200th or whatever, and be walking a lot of the marathon, and that just kind of kept happening. And a friend of mine who was a doctor pointed out to me that he knew I had a high sweat rate. I knew I had a high sweat rate. That was obvious. It just drips off me when I'm training. And he said, I think you're losing a lot of salt as well, a lot of sodium. And so I thought, what do you think? Why do you think that? And he said, well, you've got all these salt marks in your eyebrows, on your kit when you finish, and you're basically getting cramps and suffering symptoms like hypernatremia, which is low sodium levels. So he said to me, look, get down to the hospital. He arranged for me to do a sweat test, which is with a piece of equipment that they use for different diagnostic purposes in hospitals. Took a sweat sample. Sure enough, on the scale of 0 to 10 in the normal population, I'm at a 10 for how much salt I lose in my sweat. I lose loads. Effectively, my sweat is very, very salty. Wow. And what I learned then, and he looked at, we did a very simple spreadsheet. He looked at how much fluid I'm taking in a race, how much sodium I was consuming, and he just said, you've just got to turn the dial up hard on the sodium, and maybe even reduce down the fluid actually that you take in, because I was overcompensating by
waterlogged.
What exactly that? Yeah, the Tim Noakes thing, the waterlog thing, and with that adjustment, so a lot more salt, a lot more sodium, and a little bit less fluid, or a little bit more mindful about how much fluid. It was like that. It was like night and day. It was the difference. So this happened to me quite late on in my career, and it meant that I didn't have many chances to then really kind of press on it. But I did enough, and I have done enough since to know that this was a critical piece of knowledge that I didn't have as an athlete.
Because I've often wondered why that, I've got certain athletes that I've worked with or over the years where they just keep getting cramps no matter what. And like, you throwing magnesium at them, you're throwing electrolytes at them, and they're still doing it. And you're like, what is going on in there? So, it'd be interesting to dig into those whole theories, that neuromuscular theory versus the sodium theory and all that sort of stuff.
On that point, we get approached a lot these days by athletes who will say, I've read some of what you've written, and because one of my big symptoms is cramping in races. I would typically get 4 or 5 hours, or maybe a little bit more, into a long race, and then the cramps would start. And then once they started, it was hard to get rid of them if you could, and then it's kind of survival from there on in. Very, very frustrating. And but a side effect of taking the additional sodium for me was that it made a huge difference. And I wouldn't say I eradicated cramps, but I went from being the guy who cramped every time to like it rarely and infrequently hampering my performance. And what we find when a lot of people turn to us and say, yeah, I've tried taking electrolytes, I've got cramps, it's like, okay, well, what dosage have you tried and with what amount of fluid? Because I was taking electrolytes and I assumed very naively, back when I was a youngster racing, that electrolytes were like some kind of magic element, like pixie dust, that you just needed to take some. Even though I was a sports scientist, the dose response relationship hadn't made it into my head with regards to that particular thing. So it was only when my friend Dr. Jutley said to me, you need to be taking like 5 or 6 or 8 times more than you're taking. You are just like not taking anywhere. I was taking, for instance, like a couple of 100 milligrams of sodium per hour in a race. And it turns out in a hot race, I needed well over 1,000 milligrams per hour.
Wow. So these sweet tests that you guys do are just absolutely crucial. And I've never even heard of that, like, to be honest, I've never come across that. Like, you sort of intuitively know, like when you're doing ultras, say in the desert, you see who's really crusty, like really who's got the real like salt crust, and you think usually the guys are sweating a little bit more, and but I didn't realize it was such a big genetic factor or whatever that is the cause of it.
I think it is probably genetic. It's different when we test and retest people's number doesn't tend to move around much for them. It's very stable. So, it's essentially how your sweat gland functions, because your sweat is drawn from your blood plasma. We know that your blood plasma is homeostatically controlled and it's very, very salty. So just to put some numbers in context, in your blood, you've usually got about 3,600 milligrams of sodium per litre. And in sweat, you can lose anywhere between 200 milligrams per litre and 2,000 milligrams per litre.
Geez, so that's a big difference.
Yeah, it's a tenfold difference, which is why there's so much controversy about this subject, because you can talk to like 5 different people, and if it's based on their personal experience, you can get 5 different opinions. And what it's meant is, and people love a bit of, you'll know this from training and coaching and stuff, people love simple one size fits all, like soundbite advice, like, oh yeah, with electrolytes you need to do this, with fluid you need to do this. And the reality is there's a little bit more, or a lot more nuance in it, but that goes over a lot of people's heads. And that
personalization with this type of thing is just gold. So that's great that you have that ability to do that now. Like that's not been around, not in the general population, that they could go and get a sweat test and find out how salty are they,
Well, that's what precision fuel and hydration started out as. It was me sweat testing people, simple as that. And then the natural progression is people start asking you, what should I be drinking or what should I be taking? And so we used to buy in different electrolyte supplements, put a spreadsheet together, work out this one's got 500 milligrams a litre, this one's got 300 milligrams a litre, and then trying to say to you, okay, Lisa, we got your sweat test results. Your sweat's like this. These are the type of events you do in these conditions. We recommend this product to be a good fit for you. But then that product might not be available in New Zealand, or it might not be available. You might have to mix it twice as strong as it's supposed to be, or whatever. So that's how the company was born, because we just made different strength electrolyte drinks. So we made a like making t-shirts, instead of one, like everyone makes a medium, we make a small, medium, large, and extra large, which is the menu is like a weak, moderate, strong, and super strong electrolyte drink. And that's what got us off the line.
Right. What about the whole the issues with gut, and when I would take, and I must admit, so I've used lots of different electrolyte products over the years, and I found the tablets to be better for me than the drinks, because I always have trouble keeping the drinks, and I stopped liking the taste, and then I wouldn't drink it, and so I found dosing with tablets just a lot easier. And I mostly ran really hot deserts, and I didn't have a huge problem with cramping, to be honest. So haven't had that experience that you've had. As long as I was taking something, I was pretty, good to go. What about the gut issues that you get with a lot of electrolyte drinks? And then when we're talking about electrolytes, we're not just talking about sodium alone. We're talking about the potassium, and I'd love to share a story about potassium shortly, but there is a combination of things in there. And then we're also told, too much salt is bad for you, lower your salt intake and so on. And why is that not, the case for at least for athletes doing this type of thing? Yeah, so a couple of questions there, but the gut issue. Yeah, the gut issue. And then
back there. Yeah, starting with the gut issue. So I would say it's often just a simple case of, not a simple case, but it's a common case of mismatch. The Lisa's overload of sodium might be Andy's appropriate amount. And if I gave you my drink, the chances are, like, I'm on one extreme, and I know very little about your physiology other than what you've just told me, but it sounds to me like it's not screaming out that you're someone who's got really heavy sodium losses, because you would probably have found out the hard way over the years, which is what happens with a lot of athletes that are losing weight. My inference there is that if you're taking a strong electrolyte replacement, that might just be too strong for you, and that is going to not. Whereas when my body is crying out for sodium, salt replacement and fluid, I can drink and tolerate huge amounts of very, very salty fluid, because I'm obviously losing it. And the body is smart. The body knows how to, and it wants to maintain homeostasis. We just did a case study with a guy. We've got a load of good case studies on our website for different levels of intake for athletes. We just did a very detailed one with a guy in Australia who did Ironman Cairns recently. Very hot. He's failed to finish loads of Ironman races because he's got high sweat rate, high salt loss. We gave him probably the most ridiculously dialed up prescription of fluid and salt we've ever given anyone in a recent case, and said, not sure if this is going to work, but kind of, you've tried everything else, this feels like, based on your numbers, this is the way to go. And so he did the race, absolutely smashed it, crushed it. He's drinking over a litre an hour of fluid with over 2,000 milligrams of sodium in it.
Gosh.
And that would just make, I guarantee you, if I gave that to 9 out of 10 people, that would make them nauseous and vomit.
Yeah.
But for him, it was the absolute opposite. It was absolutely what his body was crying out for. So that kind of, for me, is the whole point of our existence early on. To answer your first question, it's like getting that dose response, getting that dose correct for an individual. And if you fall too far outside of what the appropriate dose is, it causes generally things like GI distress or whatever, and that's the body's way of telling you that this is not.
This is gold, this is gold, that personalization and being able to work that stuff out, because till now we're sort of like, X amount per hour per the temperature. That was about it, and your body size. And so it was a bit of a, that's about right approach. And then when you've worked so hard for bloody races, and when you fail or when you don't perform like you can perform, it's bloody devastating. So this is amazing that you can now get that really precision. And do you have sweat test centers all over the place? How does that work with you guys?
Yeah, we are based in the UK. We have a load of sweat test centers up and down the UK. We've got them across America now. We've got a few in Australia. We've got a few in New Zealand, a few in continental Europe, Canada. So not hundreds and hundreds, but like probably close to 100 now.
Wow, that's amazing.
So that's one of, if people are interested in that, like, hit the website, look for a test center. It's in the footer of our website. They can find a local place. If you're struggling, we've got an email address which is open all the time. It's just hello@precisionhydration.com. You can basically hit us up and we'll try and introduce you to someone locally who can do a sweat test. But if you can't do any of that, the next best thing is we've got a free online version of the test. So in the head of our website, you can do the free online hydration test. And it just kind of asks you a load of leading questions, like the kind of things I would ask you if I was trying to figure out if you've got high. It's things like, do you see salt stains on your clothes? Do you get muscle cramps? Do you ever feel, do you ever underperform in the heat? And we've got an algorithm that at least kind of attempts to point you in the right direction, because as you've said already, this kind of like thumbs up approach is what we've.
Well, this works for me. Should work for you. You know, which is all you have as a coach if you don't have such tools. You know, you have some tables.
Coaches, what we find with coaches and people advising athletes is that they've only got like their own experience to fall back on, plus the experience of athletes they've worked with. Now, if you imagine the distribution of sweat loss, for example, it's kind of a sweat and sodium loss. It's a bell-shaped curve. So a lot of people fall into the middle. I'm an extreme outlier. I'm on one side. Some people are extreme on the other. But, you know, like 60% are going to be in the middle of that distribution or something. So if you're a coach, there's a good chance you've only worked with a high proportion of people who fall into that middle bracket. So it's really tricky if you then come across a sort of an outlier and it's not
you're
met.
Scratching your head, like why are they having trouble?
And what we find is that there's this real trend that like you'll find, and there's some well-known coaches out there, if they're on the lower end of the spectrum themselves for sweat and sodium loss, it's never been an issue for them. And they they find it really difficult to wrap their head around the idea that it might be difficult for other people. Whereas like at first, I'm the first to put my own hand up and admit and say, when I first found out about this, I thought I'd solved the problem for everyone because I was taking a high dose and I was just like, high dose is the way to go. but you learn over time that actually that more individualized approach is the way to go. So I would say, you know, a New Zealand athlete that we work quite closely with is Dougal Allen, who you might know and have heard of. But Dougal's obviously won coast to coast on a number of occasions, very good Ironman athlete. And he found us like organically over the years because he is quite a heavy sweater and loses a lot of salt.
Wow.
And it wasn't until he put 2 and 2 together with what we were recommending that he started using our products. And we now, to be totally transparent, Dougal is now a sponsored athlete for us, but it never started like that. He was buying the products through our website, and it was only because one of the guys that works for us noticed that and said, Dougal's a great athlete, why is he buying our stuff? So, and now he's coaching a lot of people and talking to people, and he preaches the individualization message because he gets,
you know what, in everything in medicine, it should be personalized, or in health, you know, everything. We have the ability now to personalize anything because my pet space is genetics and epigenetics and stuff. And so, you know, like this one size fits all approach never made sense from the beginning. And we often didn't have the nuance that we may have now with the knowledge with genetics and so on. And it'd be interesting to find out what genes are actually at play and why somebody sweats more than others, but that's probably beyond today's conversation. But I wanted to share a little bit of a story with you. So years ago when I was in Alaska and I was doing kayaking down the Yukon, or canoeing down the Yukon, and trekking and doing all that sort of stuff. And I'd been pushing my body for weeks and poor nutrition and so on. And I started having these cramps and I just ignored it, you know, carried on. And then one day we came off a mountain and I was in a library and it was freezing cold and I'd been, you know, not hydrating right, not doing anything right, especially back then. And all of a sudden my whole body went into a cramp. And luckily I was in a library. And so I had what was called a tetany seizure. And this is where the whole body cramps, like your face muscles, your heart, everything. And you very often die, you know. So luckily I was like 2 minutes from the hospital when this happened, and there was an ambulance person in the library and they saved my life. It got me to the hospital, but my potassium level was at 1.4. And that was like, you know, not, they'd never seen that in a living person before. So potassium is another really key thing in hydration. I had another example with a friend of mine. We were racing or actually doing a documentary called Run the Planet in the outback of Australia. It was a pilot for a TV series we were trying to get off the ground, and we did the pilot. We didn't get the TV series, but he was taking ones that were just sodium, like they didn't have a lot of potassium in it, and he ended up with the same problem at 120 k's in 40-degree heat with a tetany seizure. And was also lucky to survive that one. So this can be deadly when you get it wrong, especially when you're pushing ultra distances in really hot climates. But in both of those cases, it was a potassium thing as well. Have you come across that? And do your hydration electrolytes have potassium in them as well?
Yeah, but I've not personally come across that scenario. I've read about it, but I've not come across it. I've not got personal first-hand experience, but I can imagine. Yeah, I have actually had like full body cramps myself, but right at the end of an Ironman race or something, and they've tended to. I've been admitted to a medical tent, but they've tended to resolve over the next few hours rather than needing like really emergency intervention. But the thing about body fluid and electrolytes is that they are the absolute levels of them are important, but what's even more important is the relationship between the ratios between them, because sodium is the predominant electrolyte in your extracellular fluid, and potassium is the predominant electrolyte in your intracellular fluid. And when you get those two seriously out of whack, that can cause problems no matter if you've got the right level of one or the other. And I think typically what happens with 90% of athletes that have electrolyte disturbance is it's a sodium imbalance issue, because extracellular fluid is very sodium rich. It doesn't have a lot of potassium in it. And so it's rare that you can, in a short endurance race, that you can sweat out enough to lose a decent amount of potassium. If you're eating any semblance of real foods, you're probably going to put some potassium back in and you're going to stay within the levels. But when you go really, really long, and particularly like say with your friend there, he might have been taking a vast amount of sodium but no potassium. That can cause fluid shifts in the body, which mean that your sodium and potassium balance gets out of whack. And as you've pointed out, like potassium imbalance is really detrimental.
Deadly.
It's stop your heart. I mean, when my friend who I mentioned at the beginning, Dr. Jutley, who identified this problem with me, he's a heart surgeon. And I was lucky enough years ago to be invited into theatre to watch him do a heart operation. And what they do is they infuse potassium into the circulatory system to stop the heart. So you know that potassium, and that's why you can't buy over the counter very easily potassium supplements.
You have to be careful with it.
Really careful. So what we do with our supplements, for example, is there's not a great rationale for saying that potassium is a critical ingredient of a sports drink for most people, but we put a basic amount in there, an amount that's kind of similar to what you might lose in the average person's sweat, as a kind of fallback, just as a top up, just to make sure there's some kind of relationship between the two, so you are putting a little bit back in. We major on the story around sodium because acutely that's the one that you're likely to get low on as an athlete. But what I think you're highlighting there especially is that there's a lot that that's not well understood about the physiology of going for ultra endurance days and days and days, when you can definitely become depleted or get imbalanced across any of your electrolytes.
Exactly. And you know, like the potassium being on the inside of the cell. So what happened in my case, from my basic understanding of it, is that it was squeezing all the fluid out into the extrastitial space. And that's why I was cramping like that. And that's, you know, it leads to heart attack basically and death pretty quickly if you're not able to get help. And keeping that balance. And then there's also magnesium in the mix too, and magnesium's been spoken about for years for the cramping thing. What's your take then on the magnesium part of that equation as well?
If you read the typical sports science literature on that, magnesium is the role of magnesium is minimized because it's not, again, you don't lose vast amounts in your sweat. It's very, very small amounts of milligrams of magnesium, like single digits often, that you lose in your sweat, compared with hundreds of milligrams of sodium, for example. But there are enough cases of people who anecdotally get cramps and take magnesium supplements, and it helps them to sort of at least make you vaguely sit up and take notice. And I guess the likely scenario there is possibly something to do with more long-term magnesium depletion, either a diet that's deficient in magnesium, or a malabsorption of magnesium, or something that's causing that. I would say it's unlikely that people would sweat enough and it would be acutely a magnesium deficit in sweat, but of course layered on top of other things that could be beneficial, that could be influential. And what we always recommend is, like, we have the very strongest electrolyte supplement we do is called pH 1000. You can get it in a tablet or you can get it in a packet, which you mix in water, and you drink that. It's got like 3 times as much sodium and a basic amount of magnesium, calcium, potassium in there. And if you drink that before exercise and during exercise that normally makes you cramp, and makes those cramps go away, then that is essentially the acid test. And that for most people,
combo.
That high dose, it tends to we find when we do this annual cramping survey to our database, we find that intervention is effective about 7 or 8 out of 10 cases. There are, and I'm sure you've come across them, there's always a handful of cases that don't seem to respond to electrolyte imbalance. And that's where you're looking at for different theories. Neuromuscular theories and that sort of thing. But I would say we have a skewed view of the world as endurance athletes, because most of the cramping that we come up against is in endurance sport. Yeah. And I would say at least the majority, if not a vast majority of that cramping can be alleviated with the right electrolyte, with the right sodium supplementation. But it's so difficult to get like hard data on it, that most of the time we have a protocol that we recommend to people, which in the blog that you've mentioned on our website, it's quite well documented. What brilliant is. Yeah. And then people can try that. And I would say we have some of the most unbelievably warm and friendly and thankful emails that we get from people about people who've cramped for 10-15 years doing whatever sport, and then they read that and they try it, and then all of a sudden they get on top of their cramping issues, and it is just a game changer. Because I know that for me, I'd have pretty much paid any amount of money to someone who could take those cramps away. I remember back in the day, I was having acupuncture and sports massage, and I was trying all sorts of things, and probably what I needed was a $10 sodium.
Yeah.
And so
there's so much controversy in this whole thing, like over the years, starting, because my career started back in the dark ages, and I remember the first desert that I trekked across, and we got salt tablets, and it was like, oh, you shouldn't have salt tablets, you're gonna die from too much sodium. And it was like, we got them and we needed more than that. And now there's a lot, like the magnesium, like a lot of people are deficient in magnesium from a long-term perspective, and you're looking at nutrition levels in the general population. Magnesium is one of those things that I think a lot of people should be supplementing with, and there's different types of magnesium. And just as an anecdotal story, I was helping a lady who was having massive cramping issues, and she was severely overweight and not an athlete, but someone was really strange. She was in hospital for 3 weeks, and they were doing all sorts of tests on her, and they couldn't find anything what was going on. And I said to her, apart from dietary changes and stuff, can you add in some magnesium? Can you put in some magnesium into the mix? She put in the magnesium, out of hospital the next day. First time they had a night without cramps, and she was able to get home and go from there. And sometimes this is something as simple as somebody's never looked at that. Your electrolytes are absolutely crucial, in this whole balance, and keeping the body in that homeostatic state is just really, really important. And I think what we're highlighting from this conversation is there is nuance to this argument, like there should be with all medical things, by the way. It should be always nuance. How does it fit to you, your specific situation, what your goals are, what your history is, what your genetics are, and being able to tailor it to that. So you've got your electrolyte tablets, you've got your electrolyte powders as well. What other things do you have in the mix? So you've also got the carb fueling, and this is another really, the hot debates all around the world about fat adapted athletes and keto diet, and then other athletes who, you have to have so many carbs per hour, and here's the perfect fueling plan. And I gather you and I have come from in our day and age, it was just carbs, eat more carbs. Yeah. And now there is some really interesting research around keto diets and fat adaptation. But if you're a carb-based athlete and you aren't fully keto adapted, which is most of the people, what are you recommending in that case, for carb fueling?
No, it's you made loads of really good points there again. And I reckon, so back in the 80s, 90s, it was just carbs. It was all about carb loading. It was off the back of a lot of the work in Sweden, where they did muscle biopsies and looked at glycogen levels and found that basically if you carb loaded before endurance events, lo and behold, you went faster for longer because you had more fuel. And that sort of persisted to the point where all other macronutrients were like fat in the 90s was demonized massively, and you couldn't have fat. I remember like
low
oil,
fat everything.
you used to spray oil into your frying pan instead of pouring it in. You know,
Vegetable oils too. Oh, terrible.
Yeah. I mean, I don't, because as an endurance athlete, you weren't trying to gain muscle. I don't think we even worried about eating protein, you know, protein. And it was expensive if you were a student. So I just used pasta. And
it's a wonder you had a great performance at all, really, if you think back into
exactly. Yeah. But at the same time, you sort of then we've gone a lot harder in the early and mid 2000s into, you know, the keto and the fat adapted thing, and it's all gone through. But the pendulum feels like it's swinging back a little bit in terms of there's been a relative amount of pushback about fat adaptation, because the science still basically for the vast majority of endurance athletes, and if we let's stick below, say, you know, Ironman and kind of the 1 day stuff, if you're doing the event in a day, then if you're fit, you're generally, like when I used to do an Ironman, I would be at a heart rate of 160 beats a minute, and like that's pretty, you know, it's like hard endurance work. So you are burning predominantly carbohydrate if you want to go. And we know from looking at what Tour de France cyclists eat and all that sort of thing, there are no fat adapted Tour de France riders who are eating, you know, they're not eating bacon on the way around. They have energy gels for loads of carbs. These guys are actually smashing 90, 100, 120 grams of carbohydrate an hour at the peak of when they're working really, really hard, because the more carbohydrate you can oxidize, the more quickly, the lower the oxygen cost of doing exercise and the faster you can go. So this is why marathon runners are chugging down concentrated carbohydrate drinks where they didn't used to, because it stops you from hitting the wall and it allows you to run faster. So I'm very much in the camp, and I don't think it's a stretch to say that the vast majority of the scientific evidence and the evidence of working with elite athletes shows that if you want to go fast doing endurance events, even for multiple hours, carbohydrate is your friend, and you kind of need to work on ways to maximize intake and absorption. So with fast moving athletes, our minimum carbohydrate recommendations per hour, starting around the 60 gram per hour range and go up to the 90 gram per hour. And then on a case by case basis, we might even recommend that people go beyond that for periods, you know, to 100, 120 grams, if you get different people who can tolerate
the different, because it's always the trouble too, is the uptake of it, you know. Can you digest it, you know? And
that's pretty individual, and there's maybe a bit of a link between, you know, like training and training your gut to uptake and otherwise. So I would say, you know, if I've got a hat on in this argument, it's probably leaning towards not to the exclusion of fat burning and fat adaptation, but I'm in the camp. And by the way, this is based more as the scientific evidence for me backs up what I actually see on a day-to-day basis of working with elite athletes, because we work with a load of elite athletes and we analyze the race intakes, and they're on our website if people want to read them. There's case studies with loads and loads of elite athletes doing really well in endurance events. Very few of them, I think there's hardly any case studies, and we don't cherry pick them, but they're just not taking less than 50 or 60 grams of carbs per hour and that's like standard. And when you think about that, even for in a standard energy gel, that's like 2.5 energy gels per hour, which you say that to a lot of people, are like, wow, that's a lot. And it's like, well, it is, but there's a reason. These people, elite sport is a proving ground for stuff that works. People don't do things for very long that don't work, and they double down and continue to do things that do work. And so when you see loads of elite athletes doing that, you have to sit up and take notice. And so, like, coming full circle with the fat adapted argument, it's like, well, we know that any amount of endurance training helps your body to become more efficient at burning fat, because you rev up all the metabolic and cellular machinery, the mitochondria.
More flexibility, between the carb and the fat, and the
keto. You do 15, 20 hours of training a week, as a lot of serious endurance athletes will do. You're going to spend an amount of time in a glycogen depleted state where fuel is limited resource in the body. There's nobody, and I mean absolutely nobody, carbs up before and during every single session. You naturally go out and do some of your training a little bit depleted, and that teaches your body to be pretty good at burning fat. So you get this decent flexibility where you can tap into one or the other. The difference is that when you're burning fat predominantly, you're going at a slower pace, which is fine for lots of your training, but it ain't going to help. It's not going to help you racing. You know, your racing, where you get the fitness adaptations for racing is pushing the envelope.
Yeah, look, it's a really interesting debate, and I'm sort of half on the fence. I've had a couple of Professor Tim Noakes on the show recently, who's gone and who used to be like in the carb side of the equation, and he was he's Mr. Running. He's written the book Law of Running and all of that. And now more on the fat adapted side of the argument. I've had Professor Grant Schofield, who's written What the Fat, and works with a lot of elite athletes who are on the complete fat adapted scale. And I haven't got a horse in either race, to be fair. Yeah. I've been a carb adapted athlete, or carb only athlete throughout my active career, and now dabbling around and playing with keto. And I think keto diets definitely have their space, and definitely in the therapeutic space. If you've got diabetes or cancers or things like that, absolutely, or Alzheimer's or things like that. When we're talking about the speed and actually racing at high levels, it makes sense to me that there's more of a need for carbs in the mix there. I think again, this personalization is really important. I think this is something for people to play around with and test out. I'd love to now, looking back at some of the races that I did at altitude or something, if I'd been a fat adapted athlete, what could I have done and achieved? But we also have to think that I'm an ultra marathon runner. I'm running at a low intensity for long periods of time. So, days at a time sometimes, as opposed to an Ironman athlete who are, smashing it out in 8 to 12 hours, whatever, 15 hours, something like that, over a 1 day period. And it's a different beast in a way, because again, you've got a whole lot of other things like, how, nutrition levels are really different. The requirements are really different. So I think, comparing apples with apples, in other words, is also an important thing. But I think it is an interesting space to keep watching, and how this does evolve. And there are some good fat adapted Ironman athletes out there as well, who swear by it, and who swear that their ketone production is making them a much better athlete and going much faster and so on. So it's a space to watch, and I think there's a genetic component again as to how you work on that and how that fits for you and your lifestyle. And then there's also the whole thing. I think if you're going to be a fat adapted athlete, you have to do it properly, and you have to do it over weeks prior. You can't go 3 days keto before the race. It's not going to work. You need to be fully adapted, and then do that. And it'll be an interesting space to watch. I think I personally have always tried to steer clear of gels. Gels for me in my stomach have always made me vomit and caused digestive upsets. And I've never been a big fan of gels. Now, having said that, I don't know what's in your gels, and the gels now may be different to what the gels I was having 10, 12, 15 years ago. But that was my experience of that intensive shot of carbohydrates was always just too much, and I'd always end up throwing it out. And I've seen quite a lot of people run into those sorts of problems before. What do you have in your gels, and are they a little bit different than just straight? What are they? What's in there?
Yeah, so the gels that we make are very, very simple. It's maltodextrin based with some fructose as well, 2-to-1 glucose fructose ratio, because there's some reasonable evidence to suggest that helps transport across the gut more quickly. Mm-hmm. Our gels are a true gel. So where I think a lot of gels make people sick because they're basically a syrup. They're very, very, they're like a sport thing. Ours is much more like a jelly or a jam. It's like set with pectin, so it's a little bit more solid. It has absolutely no flavor. It has absolutely no color. It has no electrolytes. It's got a very, very short ingredients list, which is carbs and pectin and citric acid to set it. And that is fundamentally it. And we are almost, it's becoming a running joke in our office that we're going to name it like the gel for people who hate gels, because I would love to do actually just to try it, because the number one sort of feedback we're getting from people is that, well, I've tried your hydration stuff and I don't like gels, but I really like this one. And
yeah,
I think they have. So in that respect, I think if you do go back 10 or 15 years, a lot of the market hasn't changed. You know, a lot of the big companies are banging out the same gels they once were. We've tried to recognize that being kind on the stomach and palatability is really important for people. And also for ours, the other big feature is that they're 30 grams of carbohydrate, because all these recommendations come in at like 30, 60, 90, 120 grams. Yet most of the gels on the market are 22 or 26 or whatever. And it becomes like a mental arithmetic test on the in planning. So we've tried to simplify it. But just rewinding and going back into your chat then about the fat adapted, I'm inclined to agree with you in principle, in that there's definitely, I love this concept with loads of things about spectrums, like sweat sodium, which we've talked about, is a spectrum from, at the lower end, you've got people that lose very little sweat sodium and they have no problems with electrolyte replacement, because as long as they're taking in something, their losses are so small that they're. On the other end, you've got me and other people like me who lose tons of sodium, and we have to aggressively supplement in order to meet those needs. And it obviously in between those two, there is a grey sliding scale of like, these people probably don't need a lot, but then they might benefit from some. These people start to need a bit more. And at some point, there's like a critical point at which you really need to supplement, but it's really hard to define what that is. But we just know that's the nature of it. It's a spectrum.
Exactly.
With fat adaptation and carbohydrates, I would say there probably are some people out there who, I don't think there's anyone who can race at their best in a short, fast endurance event purely on fat, because the laws of physics and physiology dictate that you can liberate more energy from carbs faster.
Yeah.
So, but when maybe there's a crossover point. Let's say it's getting out towards the 12, 15, 20 hour stuff, where I would probably still lean on using a lot of carbohydrate in those events, but based on my past experience and my general diet, because it's a fairly normal diet. I've periodized my carbohydrate intake a little bit more as I've understood it, but generally I eat what I would say is just a mixed macros diet. There are definitely people that I've seen who seem to be able to, and your point about training it is key. You need to give it some time. You need to live the low carb life for a while. See how you feel once you've adapted. See how you perform. I've got an example of that in as a really good mate of mine who I've grown up doing sport with for years. Recently got diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic. And so he's had to like relearn the way to eat completely in the last 12 months, because he's just had to go low carb essentially. And he still exercises and all the rest of it. And a big side effect is naturally his diet's gone more heavy on protein and fat. He's saying to me that he goes out and bike rides now for like 2-3 hours, virtually just like, I just don't need to eat when I'm out, and I don't really eat when I'm out. But and this is the big thing, is like going up hills and stuff like that, he just hasn't got top end anymore. You know, he can keep going for hours. And so if you are doing something which is going to like mean you've got to keep going for hours and hours, and you in the really long stuff, if you're also genetically and mentally and all the rest predisposed to kind of like minimalizing carbohydrate and increasing fat, then essentially why not pursue trying that as giving, because at that point, at some point, you get a competitive advantage by needing to eat less, because you can carry less, you can stop less,
and you bonk less. You're not going to hit the wall.
Not going to hit the wall. So I can buy that. I'm not anti it. The caveat to all of that, though, I would say, is like, and okay, we may be skewed in the amount of people we know, but how many people do we know who that is their predominant thing that they do? Like most endurance athletes spend a lot of their time kicking around the 1 to 3 hour training sessions and the short races, marathons, whatever. And in all of that, I think that if I'm putting my neck on the block, I would say that the Tim Noakeses and people like, even though in the past I've got tons of respect for what he's done early in his career, there's this like move towards extremism on the internet where you listen to stuff on the internet or read stuff, it feels like every other athlete is doing keto and fat adapted. But then I venture out into the real world of athletes, and where are all these people? You know, they've got big voices on the internet, but there's not, it's almost like there's a lot of noise, but how many people are really doing it day to day? And that was, you might have come across Jason Koop, who's a ultra running, he's got a great podcast in the US, and Jason's a very well respected ultra running coach. He's written the book on ultra running, and said this exactly to me the other day when we were exchanging emails. He was like, look, Andy, social media, all the rest of it, it makes it feel like keto and fat adapted is kind of bigger than it is, because it's huge in metabolic health, and it's huge in
and it does have a place in there. I do believe it's got
a massive place in all of that. But it's kind of like, okay, well, there's sport, like any walk of life, there's a lot of these hype cycles that happen, and I guess my feeling on it is that maybe we're in a little bit more where the fat adapted thing is like the latest bandwagon. And I'm not accusing everyone of like immediately jumping on that bandwagon, but there is always an element of that helps to crank the handle on it, make it feel like it's bigger than what it is. And what I'm saying is, from where I'm sitting, kind of carbs have been terminally unfashionable. Maybe they're coming back a little bit, but they're still at the coalface what a lot of athletes are chomping
with 90% of the athletes that are actually on the ground. I think you'd be right there. And you know what I like this, that we have this open conversation and we can throw ideas out there, and we can have those intellectual debates without killing each other. Like, I'm the fat adapted space, and that's it, and I'm in the, well, let's try it. And maybe for you, this is the thing. And then maybe next year a study will come out that'll make me think otherwise. There's all sorts of nuance to this conversation, which is what I love, and I love when we have competing scientists actually going head to head on things, because then we can take it from our own. Sorry, my mum's doing the dishes in the background. She's just making a hell of a noise. Sorry, everyone. It's important that we have these ongoing conversations, because science is an evolving thing. We are not there. We don't have all the information yet. And there is certain people that will benefit from this and certain benefit from that. And they can both be right. And I think in the general population, we have an excess of carbs, like I'm not talking about the endurance athletes now. And from a therapeutics perspective, from a cancer perspective, I do sit more in the camp of keto is probably the better way to go, or keto-ish, where you're just cutting down on the carbs, cutting out the vegetable oils. I think we probably agree on the shitty oils, that what they do in the body. And I think this is why it's important to have these conversations and to keep having them, because we are getting more and more data. But I do think that, if I go for a 10-hour run today, which I won't be, by the way, but if I did, I'd be needing my carbs, I'd be needing them, because I'm not fully fat adapted. And if I was, I don't know if I would still be needing some. I think I'd still need some in the mix.
I think where I'd also like lean back towards the sort of the middle ground here, and certainly agreeing with you more, is that, in my day-to-day existence now, I probably cycle my carbohydrate eating a lot more around my activity levels, because I don't train anywhere near as much as I used to. So I fully see the value in, like, I will not sit down and have a predominant, in fact, quite often my evening meals will have very little carbohydrate instead of being the traditional like meat, veg, and big serving of carbohydrate, which is what I'd have eaten as an athlete. Now I'll have a lot of vegetables and some protein, and often minimal to no carbohydrates, until my kids are 5 and 8. So having like no bread in the house is not an option. But before the kids came along, my wife and I found that we were buying bread and it was going stale and going off, because we just were both naturally, we shifted away from that kind of. And the other thing which I'm leaning into quite a lot is is not. My wife is big into intermittent fasting.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And my wife is a biochemist. She's a scientist with a PhD and a researcher. So she's someone who reads about this stuff and does it from a quite a scientifically based angle. And for me, one of the things I've taken from that is I don't follow the same regime as her necessarily, but I find it relatively easy to skip breakfast and narrow the window of eating, because we eat with the children quite often. So I'll eat in the evening at 5:30, and then I can be done eating by 6 p.m. and then I may not eat until 11 or 12 o'clock the next day. So all of my eating is compressed down on that. Changes, by the way, if I'm training really hard, because I just need more calories and I just have to eat breakfast. But I've found it way easier these days to kind of I'm a bit take it or leave it with breakfast and narrowing that window of eating. And I think although that's not the same as fat adaptation, effectively what you are doing is you're firing up the same cellular machinery, the
autophagy and
by that having that period of fasting. And I just know as I'm now in my 40s and I feel I feel way better than that. I used to be, I don't know if you have the same brand in New Zealand, but I used to be like 4 Weetabix for breakfast. That was kind of.
Well, you're told that's what's healthy, isn't it? Grains.
My mum is like really health conscious person, but I think still finds it a little bit. She can't get her head around that breakfast is the most important meal of the day. You can't miss breakfast.
No, it's not true. Yeah, I mean, again, there's a whole lot of nuance to this discussion, but I think intermittent fasting is the easiest way for most people to get this autophagy going. I've talked ad nauseum on this podcast about senescent cells and trying to lower the senescent load in the body and senolytic activators, and these are all things that senescent cells, as we get older, we get more of these senescent cells that are like zombie cells that are damaged, got broken proteins, got broken pieces, and they should be killed off, but our body's machinery is not killing them off, and they're hanging around and they're putting out chemokines and cytokines into the cells around them and actually damaging cells next to them and so on, as we get more and more of the senescent load. And this is one of the problems of aging. And by doing this intermittent fasting, I mean, even longer fasting under the guidance of a doctor, if that's appropriate for you, can be really beneficial in upregulating all the autophagy, so that we're getting rid of those senescent cells, recycling all of that damaged stuff that's literally loading us down, weighing us down, and then clearing that out. It's like taking out the garbage before you bring the new groceries in. I really like that analogy, is that if I just keep bringing in the groceries and putting new nutrients in, but the cell is full of garbage, I can't get anything in. I need to be able to clear out the garbage. And this is where the cycling of intermittent fasting or even longer fasting and having periods of low carbs. And I love what you said about that. If I'm training hard, I'm eating more carbs. If I'm not training hard, I'm lowering them. And unfortunately, with our food pyramid, I mean, I think our food pyramid, that our health guidelines, which I'm sure in England are no better than here, are just disastrous, really. Like have your canola and your margarine and your low fat stuff that's got lots of sugar in it, and have your grains. And that message is definitely outdated, I think. And the Weet-Bix scenario, not picking on Weet-Bix, but like the cereals and all of that, we need to understand that the grains are not the grains that our grandparents had. They are modified, they're changed, they've got a hell of a lot more gluten in them, which causes all sorts of problems, lectins. So I think if we can test it on our gut, test yourself, be an N of one, test how do you feel when you go without breakfast and you do like an intermittent fasting. Because missing lunch doesn't bring as much benefit as missing breakfast and having a longer period of no digestion going on, and giving your body an actual chance to, if you have the breakfast but you skip the lunch, that's not going to do it, unfortunately. So it is better to do that intermittent where you knock off eating 6, 7 o'clock, whatever it is, and then go through a bit longer, maybe to 11, 12, maybe longer, depending on what you can do in terms of cutting that window down.
I don't know how you feel about this, but generally I'm quite relaxed about some days I will have breakfast if I just feel like I need it. I don't tend to do this regimented or rigidly. It tends to be more of a day by day thing. You know, if I've not slept well and I'm feeling stressed and that kind of thing, I generally I probably need to, I feel like I need to eat a bit more, so I will. And then once I'm at work, I just try to, like today, I think I had lunch at 11 a.m, but then I didn't eat again properly until I got home at 6 p.m. Whereas other days I'll have lunch at 3 p.m. You know, it just
it
really,
is life. That's life, isn't it?
I try not to be stressed about it. And that whole thing about, you know, like I do it when I'm training hard, which is infrequent these days. I tend to train daily, but I just don't put the volume in that. I
like me,
like 45 minutes a day. So that even if you train hard for 45 minutes, you can't run yourself that hungry, you know, quite often. So but when we see the opposite problem with athletes that are training hard, which is, and I've written a blog on this in the past about, you know, REDs, you know, relative energy deficiency in sport. And, you know, so that's where I come back around to the whole thing about one of the damaging messages around intermittent fasting and fat adaptation and all the rest of it is for athletes that are training really hard. They then feel like they want to double down and be fat adapted and intermittently fast, and all of a sudden then what you actually,
and they're undernourished then.
you undernourish yourself and deprive yourself of energy. So there's loads of, and your phrase there that you just used is one that I use all the time, N of one. You just have to look at the individual situation, because what's appropriate for you. You asked me earlier, and we never really got back to it, about like salt in the diet, how we're told to take less salt. Well, it's the same as carb as far as I'm concerned. It's like, if you're not doing a lot and not sweating a lot and not losing a lot of salt, your general diet probably contains adequate to excess salt. If you go out and start sweating 2, 3, 4 hours a day and doing loads of exercise, you could very quickly go from excessive to deficient. It's the same with carbohydrate. You know, you cannot say that everyone in the population should have 3,000 or 3,500 or 2,500 milligrams of sodium. That is just that's the most ridiculous thing. The government doesn't say everyone should wear size 8 shoes.
Exactly.
Because that statistically will fit the most amount
the
of
average
people.
person.
Yeah, it's not.
It's a good analogy.
It's rubbish, you know. And so that's again where some of the confusion with all this stuff comes in. It's like, well, the only right answer is the one that applies to you, your genetics, your epigenetics, your situation, your training,
sex, your like hormones. You know, women's cycles is another thing where, you know, you'll need carbohydrates at certain times of the month more than you'll need more protein at other times of the month. You should be training. There's no nuance on that conversation. I think that's another area that's, you know, sort of neglected. Women to just train the same all month round and, you know, be done with it. Well, you know, there is nuance to there as well. You know, where you're going to perform better at this time, you're going to do more trouble to yourself at that time. And it is more complicated, and it isn't fit in a sound bite, and it takes a coach and it takes more effort. But if you're wanting to be at the top of your game, those are the conversations that you should be thinking about and having with yourself and testing it around that. And I think, there is a lot of undernourished, you know, and I was probably one of them, often an undernourished athlete, and, you know, trying to push things to the absolute limit all the time, you know.
Yeah, well, we've got on our website, as well as the online sweat test, if you go to the fueling product page, we've got a little thing called the quick carb calculator, which is just a really quick tool which we try to use with athletes to show them when you're exercising really hard, and it is for when you're doing stuff at a harder pace, then how much carbohydrate you need per hour. So you answer some 3 questions about the type of exercise, the duration of the activity, and the relative intensity on a slider, and it will give you a sliding scale of carbohydrate to need per hour. Because again, that's just a useful tool, because what we find is that athletes that are doing the longer, harder stuff tend to under calculate what they might need, rather the amount of conversations that we have, which is actually like, you should be taking a little bit more rather than a little bit less. And then, like with the hydration and the cramping study, the feedback, we get amazing feedback from some athletes who are like, well, you know, I didn't believe that I should take 3 gels an hour while I was doing this race or whatever, but I've done it now, and wow, the difference is like night and day. And you just kind of think, well, yeah, that's, and that comes back to the principle of what through our website and what we try and do. And if people have like listening to this and thinking that they want to learn more about that stuff, we've got a knowledge hub on our website with loads of good blogs in there. You can contact the team and book one-to-one video calls for free with our sports science team to ask these kind of questions, because what we've found is that I don't think there's any other sports nutrition, sports fueling company out there that I'm aware of where you can talk one-to-one with the people at the company. But that's such an important part of what we do, because of what we've talked about, which is like every situation is individual and different, and people want individual answers. So we try and write articles that help you get the context for what you're doing, but then we offer this service of one-to-one calls, because then you can really drill into your individual questions. And
that is just amazing, Andy. That blows my mind, because I know what that, as a business, I know what that requires. That's a huge commitment to your public. That's a huge commitment from you guys. It started during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, because we were all stuck at home in lockdown. We weren't going to expos and events, and we sort of said to the team, look, what do we miss about doing that? And someone said, well, it's great because we get to talk to athletes and one-to-one. They said, well, let's put it out in an email and say we'll do one-to-one video calls while the pandemic's happening and everyone's stuck at home. And in the first 2 weeks, we had 70 calls booked in. So we had to get every single person in the team. Yes, I'm gonna say, like, you run out of people pretty quick. Yeah, we're running out of people. So and then it just carried on. Over the last 18 months, 2 years, we've basically just gradually tooled up to be able to offer it more widely. And sometimes it gets busy and people can't book a call for a week or so, but we do as many as we can, and it's just a great, and I hope as the business continues to grow that we're just trying to stay one step ahead of trying to scale that, and try because that's always the problem, as a little business owner too, when we have coaching, and that's that balance between trying to make enough to survive on and grow and scale and personalization in the mix, like how do you do that? That's the juggling game. That's why I'm like, wow, that's pretty impressive. That's amazing. The thing these days is there's a lot of tricks you can use, because automation and sort of building web-based tools is even as simple as, when we do these calls, we want to make it as quick and simple. So for the guy or girl on our team who's sat there doing the call, they need to have a slick booking system, so you're not wasting loads of man hours doing the bookings rather than doing the calls, because a computer system can take the bookings and make it all slick and back to back them and everything like that, so that we can spend the human time, can be sat behind the lens talking. Dedicated, And then over and above that, we're actually building something at the moment which is kind of called, we haven't got a proper name for it, but we're calling it the Ultimate Fueling Planner. And you would be able to come to the website in a few months. You'll be able to put in what event you're doing. It will pull the weather conditions for that event. You'll say how fast you're going to go or how many hours it's going to take. We can infer the intensity. We can get a few stats about you as an individual, and then it will essentially spit out the bare bones of a fueling and hydration plan. Now, that's not supposed to be the be all and end all, but it's supposed to get you right there. Structure. Wow. And if you can do that without talking to a human, then what you can do is take that plan, bring it to a call with one of our people to then do that final mile little bit of tweaking. But then if we can do it that way, then we can help a lot more people a lot more efficiently, because all of a sudden what would have been a 35-minute call to start this from scratch becomes a 15-minute call, because you've done most of it before you got there. And that's, I think, those are the sort of ways in which we'll try to scale and offer. Yeah, wow, that's impressive. I can learn something from you guys there, because that is always the struggle as a business, in the spaces, the trade-off for personalization versus, you're a small team, and how the heck do you get through so many people, and how do you make all that work? And Yeah, so that's absolutely mind blowing. I'm blown away by that. That's really, really cool. And I think your knowledge hub is really deep too. And it's great when you've got a team now that's behind you. And I bet when you started out, if we had conversation as two entrepreneurs, I bet when you started out, it was a bit of a juggling act trying to get everything to work.
It still is, and it is testament to the fact that we've a team of 15 full-time people now, and whilst that's not big in the scheme of companies, it's big for us because we have got a phenomenal team. We've got sports scientists and coaches, and even behind the scenes we've got phenomenal people that do our logistics and shipping and IT and all that sort of stuff. And that's
years of work.
It is. It's been 10 years of hard graft, and we're only just getting started. But now the mission is to take the core of what we try and do, which is essentially, be a resource for athletes. If I want to build the resource that I wish I'd have had 20 years ago, because if I could have talked to Precision Fuel and Hydration 20 years ago, my athletic career would have been improved significantly as a result.
Hell yeah. Yeah.
And so that's what we're trying to do, and it's only by growing a team of people who are able to do that brilliantly, because we've got people in the team now who are significantly better at what they do than I am at any of those one of those things, and so as much as I love jumping on one-to-one video calls with people, we've got some really talented sports scientists who are absolutely nailing it, who are brilliant, and that's really cool. That's what we,
as a leader, that's what you should do, isn't it? Surround yourself with people who are more brilliant than you are and better than you are at the job, and then you can just lead them.
And like we're lucky, I'm lucky to be surrounded by some really talented people, so they make it happen.
No, that's brilliant. Hey, Andy, you've been so generous with your time today. I do really appreciate the work you put into your company and the products that you're producing, and the depth of your knowledge and the science, and having some open, great intellectual debates on different issues. I think that's fantastic. I love doing that. And I'm sort of going, oh, but what about this? And, have you heard of that? Because I think that's so important. That's what's needed in today's society, is we need this open conversation around these things, instead of this is where I'm staking my sand and I will never change, because that approach is just not a good one. So Andy, where can people find Precision Fuel and Hydration? And we're going to have links, and we're going to have all that sort of in the show notes, but just let people know. Are you on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, all of that sort of good stuff?
All the good stuff. We are so precisionfuelandhydration.com, or actually, if for the shorthanded, it's pfandh.com. You'll find us on that. Our social media is currently, the old company name was at Precision Hydration, so we're still on that, but we will be, depending. I'm saying this because I know this might go out in the future, so it might be at PF and H.
Okay, so look up both of those. Yeah,
look at both of those. You'll find it. You'll always see, for people who are watching the video version, you'll see increasingly our like multicolour band is like our little tell. So you'll see that the little design feature. I would say email into hello@pfandh.com if you've got any questions. As I keep going on about, the team are incredible, and every email gets answered within, usually within 24 working hours. So sort of.
I must admit, even like preparing for this podcast, your team sent me over so much to read. It was like, dude, I'm not going to get through all that before I get to the thing. It's fantastic. Great to have such a team who is like, and this is what Andy's done, and these are all the things that you should be reading, and here's 100 photos, and here's, I'm like, whoa, these guys are onto it, it's brilliant.
No, they are. They put me to shame. They are all over it, and we'd love to hear from anyone, really. Just reach out, get in touch, whatever platform. You'll find us, if you search Precision Fuel and Hydration on the web, you'll trip over us and come and say hello.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Andy. I really appreciate your time today.
Nice to meet you, Lisa. Cheers.